Welcome to the fifth video in the Just In Case series, sponsored by Quality and Equality, an OD consultancy firm based in Oxford, United Kingdom. My name is Mayan Chung Judge, and I'm the director of the firm. We chose the name Just In Case is that some of this video is to remind you of something, just in case you didn't know about the topic, or just in case you want to refresh your memory. And just in case you want to know a topic better. And I think today, the contributor, Professor Gervase Bushe, will help you to know a topic better. Gervase will actually introduce himself a little bit later on, and his very impressive bio is at the end of the video, and you can contact him directly. I just want to say that in the last 10 years that Gervase and Bob Marshak has been collaborating, leading on the discussion of what is dialogical OD. And together they set up an institute, and within the institute they publish a number of significant articles and book chapters and book. And today Gervase is going to talk about generative change. And I just want to highly recommend the book that he wrote called Dynamics of Generative Change, which you can get from his institute website. Is a fantastic resources. Not only it is accessible, practical, and clearly written. I was very impressed at how Gervase interweave concepts with stories and application in a very elegant way. And it was the model, the generative change model is very well illustrated step by step. And there are tips about how you design generative conversation. And there's a process grid on how to do launch and an illustration of how to do probes. And today, I think Gervase is going to introduce to all of you, what is this generative consulting look like. So enjoy. And Gervase, over to you. Would you please let them know a little bit about you before you start? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jervis Bushe. I'm the Professor of Leadership and Organization Development at the Beedie School of Business at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. I'm also the co-founder of the Bushe-Marshak Institute for Dialogic Organization Development. And after 2 months of being home and shelter, in desperate need of a haircut. I'm going to be talking to you today about generative change and generative leadership, but I need to take a few steps back in case you're not already familiar with Dialogic Organization Development, which is a concept Bob Marshak and I have been working on for 12 more years now. And this was an attempt to understand what goes on underneath the hood of OD processes like appreciative inquiry and future search and World Cafe and conferencing and many other techniques that appear very different on the surface and all violate kind of the original organization development notions of doing diagnosis and looking at organizations as open systems. And we've written quite a lot on this, and all of that's available for free download from the BMI website, which we will give you a link to at the end of this talk. But a couple of the key things to note is, one, this idea that what is behind what we're calling dialogic OD, which we think is the processes that really result in transformation in teams and relationships and organizations, is a mindset. It's not about the technique. There's a lot of different techniques, and these techniques can be used in different ways, but when people are really successful with them, we believe that it's because they're operating out of a certain way of looking at the world. And this way of looking at the world sees organizations primarily as networks of meaning making, where what takes place has to do with the conversations and the narratives that are being used to generate those conversations, decide what's right, what's wrong, what we should do, what we shouldn't do. The underlying enablers of change and that inform this dialogic mindset come primarily from social constructionism and from complexity science. And it's a combination of those two things. And so the three main enablers of change is one, disruption and the use of self-organizing processes. The idea that, emergence and self-organization is nature's way of changing. So let's harness that in how we try to work with humans who are, of course, part of nature. And the second is that to create change that's lasting and sustainable, we have to change the underlying narratives, the key storylines that people are using to make sense of themselves and their organizations. And that unless you change those, you haven't really transformed much. And the third one is generativity, that what these change processes do primarily is help to generate new ideas, that the most powerful force for change is a new idea, and that what we need to do is create generative processes and generative conversations and utilize generative images to enable people to have conversations that result in new ideas, new solutions that people actually want to act on. To make this easier to understand, we're going to start by showing you what many of you will recognize as a traditional plan change approach. Right? And in plan change, which is underlying action research and what we call diagnostic organization development, you begin by defining the problem, then you want to collect data, do a diagnosis, analyze that information, then come up with an idea for how you're going to solve the problem or create the change, which requires usually the development of a vision by the senior leadership about where you're trying to get, create some kind of action plan, usually action teams, and then implement, evaluate, monitor, and you're around the cycle, right? And organization development in particular would engage people who are going to be affected by the change in doing the data collection and data analysis and coming up with solutions, but usually only in small groups. And then large group interventions came along and said, well, we can do the same thing with a lot more people involved. That would be better. And in many ways it is for creating change. But what I would argue is that that system of change, by and large, hasn't been very effective. As you're probably aware, most studies find that only about 25% of change projects actually work. And I think that has to do with using those kind of change processes to manage a different kind of problem, which Ron Heifetz called an adaptive challenge. And that adaptive challenges aren't well managed by the traditional plan change approach. And instead, people who are successful at helping organizations to manage adaptive challenges utilize what I'm calling a generative change approach. The diagram you're seeing now is an attempt to kind of simplify all of that down into some steps that help to make this understandable to managers and leaders. And what it says is, okay, so first you identify the adaptive challenge that you're trying to deal with. So, and I'm going to tell you a story of one of my client groups, and this actually is written up in my latest book called The Dynamics of Generative Change. So we start out here with the supply chain for a large organization that's distributed across a large geographic area, and it has 5,000 different items that are coming through a central warehouse and being sent out to 26 different regional warehouses. There's a lack of collaboration between different parts of this organization. There's an antiquated IT system. There are internal and external customers who don't follow the rules about how you're supposed to order and pick up stuff. Some people in the organization break the rules to supply those people with things that they need, even though they didn't follow the rules. This has been going on for years. It's causing increasing amounts of a sense of all their processes being out of control, people getting yelled at every day. Somebody shows up, wants something, a person following the rules says no, so that person calls their boss, who just pounding on somebody's head, giving them on and on and on. So a lot of complexity, and past attempts to try to manage these challenges using a plan change approach have not been successful. So the first thing that has to happen as you look at the adaptive challenge is reformulated into something I call a purpose statement. And that purpose statement needs to identify both the challenge, but also what it is that people who are going to have to meet that challenge care about. Because transformational change does not happen unless people care about what you're asking them to do. That's number one. Number two, you can't utilize self-organizing processes amongst a group of people unless those people share a common purpose. If they share a common purpose, then they'll figure out a way to make it happen. So in this case, what happened was after a period of time of trying to noodle out, what are we really trying to accomplish here? And what they figured out was if they could just find ways to really standardize their work processes, it would really reduce the amount of variance and complexity people were facing. They'd make their job easier. They would be able to satisfy their customers, which was their main source of motivation and pride. People wanted to satisfy their customers. That was their main source of motivation and pride. It was also their main source of pain. And this is another thing that tends to happen when you're dealing with an adaptive challenge. There are typically some paradoxical things taking place. And that was true in this case as well. And that's one of the reasons why trying to follow a linear sort of change process typically doesn't work. Anyway, the purpose statement they came up with was different from what their purpose normally was. And their purpose is, as an organization, was to make sure the right materials were in the right place at the right time. The thing with that purpose statement was it had been talked about for years. People already had a point of view on why they were unable to do that. It wasn't going to create any sort of new conversation. And the best purpose statements are something I call a generative image. And on this slide, you see some of the definition I've created for a generative image. And, the iconic generative image of our time is sustainable development, right? Before sustainable development showed up, ecologists and business people had nothing to say to each other. They were at war with each other. And in the late 80s, sustainable development showed up. And all of a sudden, within months, in the Western world, business people, government types turned to these environmental organizations, which had been screaming for years, listen to us, and said, yeah, okay, we're listening, what should we do? And that generative image has spun off multiple innovations over the last 25 years, and still nobody can define what it actually means. And that's one of the qualities of a good generative image, is that it's ambiguous, even as it's appealing. So in this case, the generative image they came up with was stress-free customer service. Right? The stress-free part, responded to the need to standardize, simplify, make things, and the customer service part responded to the inherent desire and motivation people in the organization had to satisfy their customers. And so what this did was it allowed them to then organize a series of events where groups of people from all different parts of the organization came together to discuss how do we get more stress-free customer service. You don't have to talk about, who's to blame, what's broken, why things aren't working. You get people focused on a future they care about and they want, and open it up and then what these events are designed to do. And there's a lot of different OD methodologies that can be useful for this, and a good Dialogic OD consultant will mix and match. But what you're essentially trying to do during these events is allow people from different parts of the organization, or in the same part, who have similar interests and a similar agenda and similar motivations to get together and come up with a good idea that they're keen to go do, and then say, go do it. And this is the key part about generative change that makes it different from a planned change approach. It's not that you bring people together to come up with a good idea and then give it to leaders and say, okay, leaders, go do something with it. Instead, you bring them together, and what you want to do is launch as many different change projects as possible. In this organization, they called them pilot projects. The first time we brought people together, they launched 11 pilot projects. Some were quite simple, but had a profound impact on their ability to create stress-free customer service. Some were quite complex. And what that required was leadership to come in behind that and then orchestrate some more generative conversations to help move those things along. one example is, out of the first conversation in this organization, they decided, one group said, we would really create, stress-free customer service if we could reduce delivery times from our central warehouse to our regional outfits from 3 days to 1. And of course, the leadership team thought that was ridiculous. And why did they even propose this? But they decided to get behind it and orchestrate another event. And what happened at that event blew their minds, as warehouse employees figured out a way to redesign their whole system. And within 6 weeks, they were delivering in 1 day. Now, I marvel at what would have happened if those ideas for how to do that had been given up to the leaders, and now they're supposed to do something with it. I mean, 6 weeks later, they'd still be talking about it, rather than what happened in this case was that things happen because people come out of generative engagement events. If they've got a shared purpose and you've given them time to figure out what they can be doing tomorrow to help make that purpose happen, just go do it. Amazing things are able to get done. But what's even more important, I think, is that process helps to create a more agile, adaptive organization. The culture, the narrative, the story people had about themselves as warehouse employees transformed over the period of this project. And this is about 4 years ago. And it is now the place in this larger organization where people go to for innovation. They know if they, senior executives know, if they go to a meeting in this part of the organization, like unionized employees are going to be at the table and they're going to have some of the best ideas. And they're going to, and if a problem shows up, they'll just figure out a way to fix it. And that's just the way they do business. Right? It's become the way they do business. So you launch these pilot projects, as many as you can, and the explicit message is, we don't expect you to succeed, but we expect you to try. And we're going to learn. The role of leadership then, what I call generative leadership, is very different in a generative change process. It's not front-end loaded at trying to, articulate the vision and figure out what the right solution is. It's back-end loaded. You try a lot of different little solutions and you look for what's working and what you can build on. And so it's a lot more like a farming metaphor. You fertilize the good ideas, you pull out the weeds, that sort of thing. And it takes a lot more leadership effort at the back end. And one of the problems, I think, with a lot of ways in which people use Dialogic OD methods to create summit-like experiences where there are great dialogues and great conversations, is too much time and effort is spent worrying about the event and not nearly enough time and effort spent worrying about what's going to happen after the event. How are we going to take that motivation and that energy, momentum we generated and amplify it? How are we going to stay on top of what are the changes that are taking place as a result of it and find ways to amplify it? How do we ensure that people are able to access resources and time and space to work on these projects that we have just launched? Right? How are we going to figure out when something's not working? And how are we going to call it a day and celebrate what we learned? Right? So all of that needs to take place and so fundamentally, the generative change model is a model of try stuff out and learn as you go. And I think at this point, there are hundreds of studies and articles and whatever, and showing that this works. And there are different words for it now. Some people call it agile, the adaptive organization, whatever. And still, I think a lot of leaders are afraid to move into this more emergent way of managing change. And I think one of the main reasons for that is that it violates some of our central beliefs about what constitutes leadership. Right? And, you pick up just about any book or article on leadership, and the word vision jumps out. Leaders have a vision. And to run a generative change process, you need to have a vision of the process, but not a vision of the change. And that means you need a leader who shows up and says, I don't know what the solution is, but I know what the problem is. And I know who I need to engage and how I'm going to engage them in a series of generative conversations so that we're going to launch a bunch of stuff. And we're going to learn as we go. And anybody who's tried that finds they get way more change way faster, but it violates this narrative we have of leadership. right? And so, the leader who shows up to his or her board or senior managers and they say, well, what are you doing about this? And they say, well, we don't know, but we're trying this thing and we'll figure it out as we go along. That's not how you're supposed to show up and talk at a meeting like that. So we need a new narrative of generative leadership. And that's what I've been working on in the last few years and studying very generative leaders. And it's a complex, difficult business of being able to hold that space of not knowing, managing the anxiety in the system, because people want to go to someone and say, what should we do? And get an answer. And when a leader says, I don't know what you should do. You need to figure this out. We'll need to figure this out together. I'll help to lead a process, but I can't give you those answers. Some people find that very annoying. And it raises the question, well, why are you the leader then? Because aren't the leaders supposed to have the answer? I'm excited about the number of different people, or even McKinsey is writing about this basic philosophy, although they don't quite can work with it because it violates their business model, which is, we'll tell you what the answer is and then you go implement it. But I think as we step into an increasingly complex world, we're finding that the issues are so complex, so interdependent, there's so many moving parts that nobody knows what the right answer is, right? Like COVID-19 has been a perfect example. How are we going to manage the business in the face of this? Like nobody knows. Nobody knows what's going to happen next week. Might be a vaccine, might not be. The government might decide this, might not decide that. And in a world where you don't know what's going to happen next, the strategy literature shows pretty conclusively that the best way to survive and prosper in those kind of environments is you try a bunch of stuff and you learn as you go. Don't make big bets ahead of time. And but to be able to do that and do that well requires a different kind of leadership. And stay tuned, because that's where we're going next.
On behalf of everyone, can I just thank you, Gervase, for sharing with us such an important topic. We hope that all of you enjoy Gervase' presentation, and hope that you can find ways to discuss this video with your colleagues at work. And if you want to contact Gervase, his contact detail and together with his book and other link or at the end of the video. So you have a good day, and thank you again, Gervase, for your time.